Don't know if you've ever, as a child, walked into a room and known that something's going on but not quite known what, okay? Or in adult life, if you've been invited to dinner with a married couple and you know that there's been an argument. And that notion, and that's what I think Deleuze is trying to give a quite specific articulation of that with his concept of sense, that something has been said, and that's connected to the secret. That's the first point. The second, unfortunately, I'm going to raise that old chestnut becoming woman, which is probably, more ink has been spilled on that than's really necessary. But because Deleuze defines the secret through what he refers to as the feminine line, and you sort of wished he hadn't used that terminology, but he did, and it's connected to what he also refers to in his book on Bacon as the northern line, which is when you look at a painting, before you know what it's about or what is being said, you know that it's a Jackson Pollock. Or before you read a sentence and you really have worked out what's going on, that it's Henry James. And so it's a line that doesn't, the strict definition is it doesn't demarcate an inside from an outside. It hasn't yet established what relations are. It's a style of relations before you know what's being differentiated. And then getting into now the main body of the paper, which I'm going to start reading, is that what ultimately I'm trying to do is contrast between Deleuze's notion of what counts as a literary theory against what was the dominant literary theory of the 80s, which was psychoanalytic or oedipal theory. Okay, so this is where the paper's going. Now, crucial to the sort of main arguments of literary theory in the 80s and into the present is the notion of the relation between the oedipal trauma and the text. So that literary theory isn't just saying, take for example D.H. Lawrence's Sons and Lovers, well the kid's obviously got an Oedipus complex, that isn't psychoanalytic reading, but somehow looking at our relation to the text as Oedipal. So what's the relation between the Oedipal trauma and the text, and how might this question negotiate what today is perceived as a demise of theory in literary artistic studies? I think we can begin by noting that today the remnants of the Oedipal frame still operate in the work of Judith Butler, Slavoj Žižek and Joan Kopček, all of whom argue that it's the distance from anything in itself that produces a maternal beyond and an other who prohibits our enjoyment of that beyond. It's because we're located within difference, system and language that we can only imagine some ground beyond system, something in itself, and then fantasise that beyond as woman. So it's our subjection to interpretation and decoding that leads us to posit an ultimate secret or sense from which we are removed, and the knowledge of which is held by the other. So Oedipus is not the secret of our being, but it's the fantasy frame through which we live the absence and impossibility of the ultimate secret. Basically, there is nothing to be known, but we imagine that ultimate unknown as the thing in itself, as woman or the feminine beyond. So consequently, self-aware or theoretical reading would attend to the ways in which texts, as structures of difference, produce the hidden. So it's not that there is a meaning and then the text gives form to that. The text is somehow a structure that produces the idea that there will be meaning. To read then, intelligently, theoretically, not as naive everyday readers, is to attend to the frame through which the fragment or part object produces, through its very fragmentation, a hidden and unrepresentable plenitude. If theory is a reflection upon how a text or work of art is viewed, then the Oedipal complex is the theoretical endeavour par excellence. It's the theory of every child who is condemned to read a world whose sense is necessarily hidden. So if you like, the human condition, which is a phrase we can't use anymore, but which I just did, is that of having to interpret, or there is a secret, which is the truth of which is beyond me. So the idea of a sense or truth that we must have repressed is produced in and through the Oedipal fantasy. The Copernican turn of Freudian theory occurs with the recognition both of Oedipus as the child's fantasy, that our world is lived from the point of view of a subject who reads a seducing other, and with the concomitant idea that this fantasy occurs through the violent intrusion of the signifier. Because we all have to speak through our code, we never grasp the thing in itself, that thing in itself is always fantasised as withheld. So experience in its human dimension of dependency is never centred on itself, but always lived through the other, and another whose existence is presented as a secret to be decoded. To know the other's desire, to overcome the limits within which one's relation to the other is mediated, is not only lived by the infant in Oedipal form. Every adult gaze at the self-contained, complete and blissfully centred world of the infant animates the Oedipal fantasy. The fantasy of an original subject whose joy is not yet subjected to the trauma of signification. Now, the main theorist, who I think is still probably the best theorist of this relationship, is Shoshana Felman, whose work has just been republished. Her work on Don Juan has just been republished with a foreword by Judith Butler, so it's sort of reinvigorating Shoshana Felman for today. Now, when she responds to the Lacanian articulation of the relation between the text and the desire to know or interpret the other, she brings the Oedipal fantasy to the very centre of literary practice. And she does two things. The first is that she says that everyday life is literary. We always have to read each other. We're always in an act of decoding or interpretation. And she says every literary act is a sexual act because it's relating to another's desire and a desire to know. The idea of a sense or presence held by the other and disclosable through interpretation structures every act of reading. The secret around which the text circles must both be imagined in order for any text to be read as a message. We wouldn't be reading if there weren't a secret withheld. But it's also, for all its necessity, strictly impossible. It's a necessary impossibility. You have to imagine the secret's there, but of course all you get is the text. The subject who gives herself to be read is affected through the distance of the signifier and is produced as secret and as hidden only through textual relations. The secret of the text is therefore central to the metaphysics of presence. There must be some original sense that subtends relations, but at the same time the necessary secrecy of sense undoes the fantasy of presence. We're always within relations, always subjected to the enigma of the text. The secret that would be there to be disclosed is affected as secret only through its dissimulation. Now, this is the disease, if you like, that Deleuze and Guattari referred to as the interpretosis of the priest, and one which I suppose is the bread and butter of anyone who works in an English department. So now what I'm going to do is give the sort of Deleuze and Guattari sort of response to this condition. Now, despite first appearance, and also Derrida, but in different ways, and of course because this is a Deleuzean event, I'm skimping on the Derrida. Both Derrida and Deleuze and Guattari, in different ways, challenge the supposedly necessary Oedipal frame of the text and transform the status of what it is to read theoretically, and in doing so have to come up with a different concept of life. So there's a lot at stake. So theory in this sense has to go beyond reliving the fantasy of a presence mediated by other. What Deleuze refers to in The Logic of Sense as the neurotic novel that produces the genesis of secrecy. Now, in the case of Deleuze and Guattari, certain writers and certain genres liberate the sense of the text from this concept of the secret by producing points of view that generate an impersonal secrecy. So they contrast secrecy to the secret. And while for Derrida it's the absolute secret that takes us beyond the sublime structure of the original secret. And it's these two ideas that I'm going to unpack. Now, Deleuze and Guattari locate their discussion of the secret in their Plateau 1730, becoming intense, becoming animal, becoming imperceptible, and that includes becoming woman within that text. Now, the threshold date of 1730 is significant, as this section concerns the overcoming of the subject who is set over against a world to be interpreted. The original Copernican turn to the subject, of course, occurs with Kant's Critique of Pure Reason in 1781, when the thing in itself starts to be regarded as necessarily presupposed but essentially unknowable. We have to imagine that there is a real world out there, but we only know it through relations. And this Copernican turn to the subject has been preceded by 50 years at least of Leibnizian, Humean, Cartesian and Newtonian theories of the nature of time and space. That is, we only know what is through a field of relations. We never know things in themselves. We never know intrinsic properties. Now, by locating their memoirs of the secret in this plateau of 1730, Deleuze and Guattari indicate that their understanding of secrecy allows for the reversal of a tradition in which thought is subjected to signification and mediation, and, if you like, a reversal of modernity. At the heart of their theory of secrecy, if it is a theory, is also a claim about modernity. Whereas Kant had precluded theoretical knowledge of things in themselves, thus producing the sense of there is an ultimate secret that's unknowable, which also grounds in ethics and aesthetics and a practical philosophy, Deleuze and Guattari insist that theory is not the recognition of one's distance from sense, but a way of intuiting the life from which sense emerges. Now, for Deleuze and Guattari, the secret has a reality that's productive of, rather than reducible to, textual relations. So they reverse this notion of a retroactive ontology. Retroactive ontology, we have a set of relations and we imagine there must have been an origin from which those relations emerge. They reverse that. There is an origin, there is a sense which produces textual relations. So it's a positive sense. There is a secret. This is a quotation. The secret has a privileged but quite variable relation to perception and the imperceptible. The secret relates first of all to certain content. The content is too big for its form. It's quite crucial that, beyond form we have the content. Deleuze and Guattari begin from an ontology of the secret which is insistently anti-oedipal and is tied to the affirmation and reality of the virtual. It's not that the needs of real material life generate a lack or desire which is then supplemented by the phantasm of the thing in itself or ultimate secret. Rather, life in its full and open virtuality proliferates with a secrecy from which any limited or material reality is contracted. In this case, then, the child, like the animal or like molecular perception, perceives worlds that are not reducible to those of signifying man. This is why the secret becomes in this plateau of becoming child, and why they look to people like Henry James, for whom, childhood perception is crucial to literary practice. It's not the case that we exist within signification, with the secret being affected phantasmatically after the event. On the contrary, the secret exists, insists, and has a force beyond constituted structures. So this is why for Deleuze and Guattari there's both the secret as content and the secrecy of the perception of the secret. Both the perceiving of what is imperceptible, we perceive that something is not fully seen, and we see this in the perception of the child who sees beyond fixed forms and stable identities. This is the function of at least some part of literary practice, to produce the image that there is seeing, but not what is seen. And an awareness that there are worlds of others, perceptions of what they refer to as secret societies. Accordingly then, Deleuze and Guattari refuse the modern capitalist Oedipal paradigm of the subject who, by virtue of the fact that he speaks, is always already caught up in one overarching system, a system whose outside is a dark beyond. There are secrets, they argue, beyond the man of speech and recognition, beyond the subject who feels the limit of his perception as a sublimity that gives him a sensus communis. There is always, quotation, there is always a woman, a child, a bird to secretly perceive the secret. There's always a perception finer than yours, a perception of your imperceptible, of what is in your box, this holding of the secret. Beyond the shared public axiomatic system of the man of reason, whose world is perceived as it would be for all others from the point of view of the subject in general, the perception that there is a secret produces other societies, or what Deleuze and Guattari in this plateau refer to as the war machine, connections of bodies linked through perceptions that are not yet overcoded as being those of man in general. Man is the subject whose world is submitted to what they refer to as the paranoid machine, where there is a prohibited secret that remains necessarily beyond. So it's a paranoid structure. Something, somewhere, someone holds the secret. Now, becoming woman, becoming child, and becoming imperceptible, they argue, are hysterical styles of secrecy that wage war on the collective structure. The minor secrets of the child are hysterical rather than paranoid because they're defined by singular symptoms. The idea that what can't be expressed in general language is given some other form interpretable only to the body that it marks. So it's not yet a shared code. It's something like what Deleuze refers to in his book on Francis Bacon as an analogical rather than a digital language. A digital language is, of course, one in which you have a set of relations on one hand and a code on the other. This is the way we teach I assume we teach structuralism to our students, that we all say you can never have just a word for table, you have to have a word for table and chairs. It's all part of a shared code. That's a digital language, one in which you have an arbitrary set of relations. An analogical language in Deleuze's book on Bacon is something like, he gives the example of trying to paint the scream rather than the horror that the scream responds to. And this is somehow giving, quite literally, the shudder of the body, the symptom of the body, the emergence of language or the genesis of language. Talk a bit more about that later on. But this is the notion of secrecy, that in order to discern sense, one doesn't begin from a digital code, but from the emergence of relations. So in addition to transforming the ontology of the secret by arguing that there is secrecy, or a potential to be perceived that exceeds constituted relations, Deleuze and Guattari also offer a specific history of the secret. Now, in modernity, this is where their claim about modernity cuts in. In modernity, they argue, the secret is made into a structuring form. The childhood hysterias of secrets, that is, perceptions of potentials that are irreducible to the constituted system of collective speech, give way to a binary structure of sexual difference. So it's in this plateau that they link modernity, sexual difference, and the secret. And this is because woman becomes the secret. There must be a truth or beyond of man in general, the secret from which we are all distanced, but the enigma of which compels us to enter into an interminable circuit of exchange and debt without exit. We go from a content that is well-defined, localised, this is a quotation, we go from a content that is well-defined, localised and belongs to the past, to the a priori general form of a non-localisable something that has happened. We go from the secret defined as a hysterical childhood content to secrecy defined as an eminently paranoid form. So if you like, in modernity, we all become adults suffering from an oedipal trauma. As the secret is made into a structuring, organising form, it's woman who takes on the role or position of absent content. It's not surprising that Deleuze and Guattari mention courtly love in this plateau, which for the Lacan of Seminar 7 heralded the Oedipal structure of modernity. Because in courtly love, and again, because this is something that Zizek has made a lot of, it's precisely through not being given or unattainable that the woman of courtly love withdraws from sense, becoming secret. So it's not that you particularly desire this woman and then she becomes unattainable. She's unattainable and therefore all that more desirable. This yields what Lacan refers to, this structure, as an ethics of dependency, which he criticises as the ethics of modernity. It's the absence of the object that precludes my enjoyment, even though the object is produced as the guarantee of jouissance only through its obstacles and secretion. I think we can see this quite clearly in structures of modernity, where it's because I'm not in a state of full enjoyment that there must be something that has been denied me. That's the structure. And if only that object were given, then I would be, once again, a full human being. And it's ultimately, Lacan argues, the woman that becomes this ultimate object or thing in itself, which precludes my enjoyment. If woman as secret, or the hidden sense that subtends signifying subjectivity in general, structures modernity, this nevertheless enables a liberation through a traversal of fantasy, or what Deleuze and Guattari refer to here as deterritorialization. If one relates to the secret not as man, for whom there is a prohibited content that is the ultimate but absent sense of our being, but as woman, for whom there are no secrets because she has become nothing more than secrecy. That's what they argue. Women have no secrets because they are the secret. Secrecy is no longer structured by an interpreting subject who must relate to the enigma of his being. Secrecy is diffused, becoming a perception of potentialities to disclose or give more than the present. This is a quotation. This is where the secret reaches its ultimate state. Its content is molecularised. So this is the idea, if you like to fight the ethics of dependency in modernity, is to somehow molecularise the secret, get away from this sense of that's ultimate secret to secrecy. Now, this is where they refer to the feminine line, which is how a particular writer or painter or stylist, instead of giving the idea is that the painting is somehow representing a sense, which is the sort of modern structure, of there are, which will make clear hopefully in the Henry James, there are enigmas or pockets of secrecy within a text, proliferating within a text. This is the notion of a feminine line, not the boundary between an artwork and its content, but within the work of art, proliferations of secrecy. And this gives what Deleuze refers to in general as a pre-personal secrecy of singularities, a pre-personal secrecy of singularity. Somehow we have to get, in the work of art, we have to move from that ontology to the actual work of art, and that's what I'm going to try and do at the end of the paper. How a particular way of writing can overturn this binary structure. But first, there is the ontology, or the theory of life which subtends this concept of the secret, which is that life is just an interacting relay of perceptions, with potentials being actualised only in their relations to other potentials. So, against the filiation, or mother-father-child nexus of the psyche, they oppose what they refer to as the epidemic. Against filiation, epidemic of the molecule. It's horrible when you hear yourself uttering these. I'm becoming Deleuzian. Okay, so they oppose the epidemic of the molecule, where relations are not determined in advance by a hidden form. So the notion is that the molecule is a potential for producing relations, and can produce, if you like, different worlds, as opposed to there is a system of relations through which we view the world. So it's not that there are terms that are then perceived. It's not that you have things that are then perceived. Terms are created through perceptions. Such networks or fibres, which they refer to in this Plateau, nevertheless involve an essential secrecy, precisely because a perception of what is perceived does not exhaust the perceptible. To perceive is to become in relation to what is other, but otherness does not give itself fully in this relation. There's always further perceptions. The secret is becoming woman, not because woman is the negation or absent other of man, the secret, but because to perceive the world not as it is for the subject in general, but in terms of its singular powers, is positively different from the man of reason. Becoming woman is at one with Deleuze and Guattari's ontological and political commitment to immanence. Now this is where I have to watch my vowels, because I'm going to make a distinction between grey immanence and grey eminence. It's very important for Australians because we only have one vowel, so to adopt a different accent. So there's not a subject in general whose world is mediated through a system. This is what they refer to as the grey eminence, that beyond. Rather, life is a power of multiple secrets, a proliferating secrecy, a grey immanence. So we move beyond the oedipal structure, the child who perceives, man who is subjected to prohibition, and woman who is the secret prohibited thing, to the possibility of secrecy, not all is given. And so this shifts us from a binary structure, a secret to be read, a content through form, to the positive affirmation of an imperceptibility that is created through the proliferation of perceivers. So secrecy or imperceptibility is not the hidden. It can become so through the fantasy of the great Oedipal secret to which we are structurally enslaved, but it can also yield deterritorialised secret societies, a secret perception of a secret war at war with the open secret of man. Such territories or secret societies are possible only because of an absolute deterritorialisation, the life that produces secrecy, the excess or surplus that exceeds both the perceived and any sense of the secret to be perceived. So now this is I want to get back to the general theory of literature offered by Deleuze and Guattari before briefly moving through Derrida and then on to Henry James. So in conclusion to that bit, literature is not the form of the secret that there is a sense to be read, but is enabled by a sense of secrecy. The creation, first what a writer or an artist has to do is something like what they refer to as the pure feminine line, which is, if you like, something like the opening of an enigma or relations that are not purely given, something like the stylistic creation of a problem. That something has to be worked out, that there is something hidden. This pure feminine line occurs when sentences no longer pronounce the essence of what is some predicable quality. X is Y, or here is a content. S is P, this is the subject, here is its predicate. But when multiple perceivers and viewers open the text to worlds not perceived. And crucial to this is, what again I'll be referring to, free indirect style. It is seen that, it is said that. Deleuze and Guattari mark a distinction here between the novella and the tale. It's the tale that has a content to be decoded. You know, we have to find the body in the, you know, the detective has to somehow find the body or the murderer or something like that. The novella, however, relates to secrecy. Something has happened. You know, you walk into a room, there has been an argument or an affair or something has happened, and those relations become spun out through the novella. And this is why they say the novella has a fundamental relation to secrecy. In both their Plateau on the novella and in the Memoirs of the Secret, Deleuze and Guattari cite Henry James, who was, I hope to demonstrate, capable in writing of perceiving the possibility of the imperceptible. So Deleuze and Guattari refer to the Henry James of What Maisie Knew and Daisy Miller. Both stories concern a young girl, one slightly older than the other, where the creation of a child's point of view allows for perceptions that are not affected from a drive for interpretation. They're not yet submitted to the system of relations among men, not yet signifying a subject for another subject. I'll get on to Henry James' brief contrast and sort of linking with Derrida. So the singularity of literature, for both Deleuze and I'm going to argue for Derrida, is its capacity to produce points of view other than that of signifying man in general. So at its simplest level, literature isn't communication. Literature is, if you like, the proliferation of enigma or secrecy. And this can be directly contrasted with Lacan, who's of course getting a revival through Zizek, so it's still worth thinking about. For Lacan, for whom all signification is already meta-language. This is because one speaks with both the submission to system and a demand that all one says issues from a constitutive desire for recognition. All language is meta-language because, in a sense, everything I say has the ultimate message: recognise me as a subject. So all language is, in a sense, about language. I am insofar as I speak, and all signification recognises and constitutes me as a subject for the world of signifying subjects. So that in this sense, all literary texts are about interpretation, are about the drive to interpret. And I think this is actually what happened in the 80s with every reading of every Lacanian, or supposedly Derridean reading of art texts became a reading about reading. And so you lost the singularity or the specificity of a text because all literature was about textuality, all language was about language. Now for Derrida, literature is the undoing. This is in his direct engagement with Lacan. Literature is the undoing of this phantasmatic oedipal closure of the message, and this is because of literature's singular relation to the secret. Now, Derrida contrasts literary language with, possibly problematically, with language in general. Language in general is history, meaning and sense. It's the assumption of an ongoing presence that can be recalled through time and represented through the word. If I don't have a notion of up meaning which remains the same through time, then the conditions of conversational speech no longer remain. That which remains the same through time, being, presence or meaning, is always affected from a marking out of time, a reduction of the singular to that which can be recalled, shared, rendered present and communicable. That's a necessary condition of speech and experience. If the philosophical logos is the discourse of man in general, where truth appeals to any subject whatever, by contrast, literature is the discourse of the absolutely singular. And so in his dispute with Lacan, for example, Derrida argues that Lacan's recognition of the oedipal scene overlooks what Derrida refers to as the scene of writing. If you like, the genesis of relations. Again, both Derrida and Deleuze a positive understanding of the literary text, which is how is it that the literary text produces the sense of the hidden. Now, at first glance, it might appear that a standard Derridean response to Deleuze and Guattari's ontology of the secret would be critical. Any attempt to intuit, write or think that which is secret and which then issues in a perception of the secret would always already be structured by the system of signification. So the first level of Derrida's theory of the secret is to argue that, in a sense, to hold a secret to oneself, to say this is my secret, is already to have somehow betrayed it. Of course, because the minute I've written it in my diary or the minute I've said, this is my secret, I've already given it a form or a content or a repeatability that has betrayed its absolute singularity. That's the sort of standard deconstructive manoeuvre. It's sort of like a private language argument. There is no absolutely singular. The minute I begin to think of it as singular, it's already taken on a form of repeatability. It's only possible to, if it is only possible to portray a secret when it takes on some external form, such as writing, if you can only discover my secrets because you read my diary, this is because my secrets were already in the form such that they could be written down in a diary and betrayable, discernible. So that in order to hold a sense or secret to myself, or in order to relate to myself, there must be an auto-affection where I recognise all my secrets as mine, and so that anything that is held to oneself as one's own is already never fully or absolutely secret. So consider the most private of memories that are unrecorded, undisclosed, and witnessed by no one other than myself. If I am to testify to this absolutely private and secret witnessing, if an event is testifiable, then it's also essentially unreliable and distanced from its supposedly pure and punctual origin. If a secret memory is to exist and be held, it must take on some repeatability that distances it from the pure event in its absolute singularity. So that, if you like, an example would be something like false memory syndrome. The absolute certainty of the memory relies on it being mine, but because it's so absolutely personal, it's also essentially unreliable, unverifiable. The notion of absolute secrecy and ownness, and also being other than one's own, is, on a Derridian perspective, undecidable. So it would seem at a first glance from Derrida that he's doing away with this notion of a-secrecy, which would produce relations. And if we were to stop at this point in our reading of Derrida, his work would appear to be in accord with the Wittgensteinian rejection of private language. A thought already takes the form of a thought of this thing, and therefore bears all the features of repeatability and generality that characterise public language. But there's a second stage in Derrida's argument. Like Deleuze and Guattari, Derrida does not accept the Oedipal triangle as the frame or fantasy of secrecy in general, for the Oedipal narrative itself has to be opened from some singular point. So for Derrida, the secret of a text is not a message one might read, nor a message that addresses me precisely through its absence or withdrawal, but what Derrida refers to as an absolute secret. Any system, any relation, any naming, any text belies that which demands to be named and thought, but which nevertheless remains separate and non-relational. So I suppose at the background of all this, what I'm arguing is that both Derrida and Deleuze have a positive ontology of life. It's actually, both of them are anti-linguistic paradigm. That is, there is that which produces relations. We may only know it through language, but language doesn't exhaust the potentiality of relations. At the same time, even though there is this resistance to a psychoanalytic notion of being subjected to a frame of reference, Derrida's ontology is nevertheless opposed to Deleuze and Guattari's grey immanence, because for Derrida one can neither name nor intuit the force that produces relations. Whereas Deleuze and Guattari's singularities are productive of relations, Derrida's singularity is belied by relations. I mean, Derrida is the philosopher of the non-relational. The absolute secret is unnameable, non-relational and transcendent. In The Gift of Death, Derrida gives this name of the unnameable to God, but only insofar as God is thought through a theology that's radically negative. So, as he argues in The Gift of Death, the other is absolutely other, namely God, must remain transcendent, hidden, secret, jealous of the love, requests and commands that he gives, and that he asks to be kept secret. Secrecy is essential to the exercise of this absolute responsibility as sacrificial responsibility. So Derrida is giving a quite ethical, and if you like, anti-modern, anti-Kantian notion that there must be the concept of that secrecy which is withheld. Okay. In charting the differences between Deleuze and Guattari's and Derrida's approaches to the secret, we arrive at one point of convergence along two radically incommensurable divergences. Both insist that the condition for the secret, the commitment to presence, meaning or sense that drives the interpretive machine, must emerge from a more radical secrecy, so something like a beyond of interpretation. The structure of a subject who reads a world mediated through a lawful system of signification conceals or secretes its genesis. But the secrecy from which relations and structures are affected is explained by Derrida and Deleuze in competing ontologies and competing claims regarding life. Derrida insists both that the absolute secret is death. He says the absolute secret is death, that which cannot be given and that which does not produce, present and multiply itself, and that this relation to death is life. So he sort of reverses it. The time that we have that likens something to something else that we can render meaningful is actually the loss of that absolute secret. So life, or the ongoing maintenance of what is, requires a marking out of time as the same, and therefore requires some element that is not itself. The pure auto-effective inner life of consciousness, for example, has to recognise or affect itself as some identifiable being and thereby lose its absolute singularity. So singularity or pure life, for Derrida, must abandon itself in order to recognise itself. It's this process of marking or maintenance that remains radically concealed, singular, non-living, never fully one's own. Life is death. That's a quotation from Derrida. Precisely because living on or living as this individual being who might bear and hold secrets already requires a loss of absolute singularity and a submission to a law of repeatability that can never be one's own. Now, by contrast, I guess it's not surprising I'm coming out with a sort of Deleuze 1, Derrida nil line here, but that's only because of the venue. I've got another version for other conferences, yeah. Depending on the day, depending on the audience. Okay, so by contrast, for Deleuze and Guattari, the secrecy that defines life is that which produces relations and which repeats itself. Life is not reducible to the extended and recognisable terms that it produces, but this does not mean that there is an absolute secret, so much as a proliferating secrecy, the omission or unfolding of relations, the virtual force of which can never be given once and for all. One is not separated or responsible for this unnameable secret, for precisely through the recognition of virtual life, one can overcome subjectivism. So if Derrida and Deleuze and Guattari are united critically against the acceptance of any already structured frame of signification, but divided ontologically, Derrida arguing for the radical secrecy of the non-relational, and Deleuze and Guattari arguing for a life of proliferating relations, they are also distinguished generically or aesthetically. I suppose a footnote to that is I would say that it's significant that the works of art they choose to argue for their ontology. Derrida will go with Mallarmé, Deleuze and Guattari, often American writing, usually modernist writing in English, and in this case, Henry James. Now, for those of you that haven't read What Maisie Knew, or for those of you for whom it's been a while since you've read it, pretty much the structure of the story, the novella, is about a child who's embroiled in a rather ugly divorce case. And there's a metaphor that runs throughout the story of one. There's two couples involved. You know, the parents separate and they both get other partners who are either manipulative or benevolent. One of the women in the story is a pool player, or a billiards player, I can't remember which, and this metaphor of, you know, the kid being sort of shifted around the pool table or the billiard table. And to put it in non-Henry James sort of colloquialese, again, this sort of probably says more about the dinner parties that I go to, but if ever you've said, oh, you know, Sally, that was a, you know, lovely cake you baked. But Mum, you said Sally was a lousy cook. You know, the capacity for children to not be self-censoring, to be this pure flow of communication, unaware of the various sort of levels of secrecy are involved. Now, what happens in the Henry James story, it's classic, which is why Deleuze seizes upon it, I think, is, in a sense, you know, the horrible thing about reading Henry James, if you don't like him, is that nothing does happen, because the event of the story is that you have a shift in consciousness of Maisie, where she moves from being that child who is a vehicle for adult communication to being a point of secrecy. I'm going to look at this in the two quotations, but she stops being a relay of information, so that, you know, the classic sort of lines, although they're given eloquently in Henry James, are, well, we all know your father's partner is a complete whore, you know, and then such the child goes back and says, but mine, you know. And this is a way of the parents never battle with each other, but use this naive child. Now, Henry James shifts from this, the perception, it's the perception of Maisie shifts from a child who is fully open to a world, for whom everything is given, for whom everything is actual, to a child who perceives what is not given, what is hidden. Okay. So in general, what James does in What Maisie Knew is to destroy this idea that the story has a meaning or content that is there to be revealed. So the first level, you destroy narrative. You destroy this desire for narrative, to a certain extent, this desire for narrative resolution. Then you create proliferating points of view. So at the level of the story, there's Maisie as she sees her father. There's Maisie as she is seen by her father. There's a father as seen by Maisie. There's Maisie seeing his father, seeing his mistress who sees his... I have to use the words mistress, it's 19th century. Seeing his father, his mistress who sees her, so that you get this proliferating level of he sees that she sees that he sees that she saw what he saw but only imagined. This is why you can parody Henry James so easily or so badly. And why you also get these unreadable Henry James sentences, which is sort of take on the structure of I could see that she saw that I couldn't see what she was thinking, and that held a certain power over me. And you have to read them over and over again, which is why they're good. As I say, good for people in English department, bad if you're on a long flight somewhere and that's the only novel you've read. Okay. Now, I've got the two quotations. The first is from, you can see that one's page 42, one's page 43. They're a page apart. And Henry James refers to an event. You could put a ... between the two. And there's an event that occurs between the two. Now, the first is you've got Maisie as just pure perception, perhaps, in the non-Bergsonian sense. Pure perception of the world. Everything is actual. The last... First, in that lively sense of the immediate, which is the very air of a child's mind, the past, on each occasion, became for her as indistinct as the future. She lives in the pure present. She surrendered herself to the actual with a good faith that might have been touching to either parent. And then ... if you can read towards the end, she was at the age for which all stories are true and all conceptions are stories, and not even a sense of true and false. The actual was the absolute, the present alone was vivid. Now, what you get at this is somehow, for those of you who know anything about American literature, a sort of celebration of the child's eye view of the world. You know, there is a time when we're not burdened by history, the past, the perceptions of the truth. We just see what is. And there's sort of this romantic elevation of the point of view of the child, which Henry James is going to criticise. I mean, I think, but not just, I think what's crucial is not just at the level of content, but through literary style and most particularly through free indirect style. In the second passage, so at the first you just get a description of the child's eye point of view of the world, or if you like, an adult's or third person's observer's description of this beautiful child's eye view. Then in the second passage you get free indirect style. The theory of her stupidity, eventually embraced by her parents, corresponded with a great date in her small life, the complete vision, private but final, of the strange office she filled. It was literally a moral revolution. Now, just to pause, when a writer as great as Henry James says it's literally a moral revolution, it's probably, I mean, it's to be a moral revolution, is that a metaphor? I mean, you start. Anyway, literally a moral revolution, and accomplished in the depths of her nature. Shift to free and direct style. The stiff dolls on the dusky shelves began to move their arms and legs, that is, from the point of view, well, unless he actually thinks the dolls have become animated. But it's not a Stephen King novel, so we imagine that this is as Maisie sees it. Old forms and phrases began to have a sense that frightened her. Now, this is classic. There is a sense. We don't know what it is. And he starts to say, she had a new feeling, the feeling of danger, on which a new remedy rose to meet it, the idea of an inner self, or in other words, of concealment. She puzzled out with imperfect signs, but with a prodigious spirit, that she had been a centre of hatred and a messenger of insult, shift back to third-person point of view, and that everything was bad because she had been employed to make it so. Her parted lips locked themselves with a determination to be employed no longer. She would forget everything. She would repeat nothing. In other words, she becomes a point of enigma, a point at which there is, instead of the relaying of communication, she suddenly becomes a point where nothing, from her parents' point of view, she becomes this child who sees nothing, says nothing, a child that's stupid. And of course we all know by playing stupid you get to see much more. So it's by not communicating, being seen to not see, that she becomes, as it were, a centre of sense. But we never know actually. So as the novel progresses, Henry James keeps saying she sees more. She sees, and we never see what she sees. So we're given this one. When, as a tribute to the successful application of a system, she began to be called a little idiot, she tasted a pleasure new and keen. When, therefore, as she grew older, her parents in turn announced before her that she had grown shockingly dull, it was not from any real contraction of her little stream of life. She spoiled their fun, but she practically added to her own. She saw more, and more she saw too much. Okay, so you have several things going on here. One is the level of style in which you get a shift to a point of view in which Maisie sees that she has been seen as stupid, and then sees that by being seen as stupid she will see more, and we never know what that is. So on the one hand, it's through free and direct style we get that she sees, that it is said, but not what is seen. And stupidity, the idea of stupidity, that not all is given. As opposed to the paradigm of communication, in language as communication, we get language as the presentation, as, if you like, of loci of stupidity. Now I just want to conclude by contrasting Deleuze's theory of sense with some more recent sort of philosophical understandings and how literary language differs from conversational language. Now, the contemporary Princeton philosopher David Lewis has written a paper called Keeping Score in Conversation, which explains how human beings maintain sense. So that if I say, the reason why John has got so fat lately is because he stopped going to the gym, and you say, well, no, it's not that, it's because he's eaten too many pies or something like that. So, you're not contesting the fact that John has got so fat lately, so that remains as a score as the conversation proceeds. But if you say, wait a minute, he's not that fat, then that gets crossed out. So Lewis says that conversation, communication and public discourse proceeds by this keeping score, that a lot of what's said isn't actually stated as a proposition, but it's implied, and it's sort of, we notch up propositional assumptions as we go without them actually being stated, and they're only sort of removed from the scoreboard if they're actually contested. And so this, for Lewis, this accounts for how you get the ramification of sense, not only in a conversation but in literary language and so on. Now, what is going on, I think, with Henry James in this story, but also with Deleuze's understanding of literature and literary style, is that you get, instead of getting a ramification of propositional sense, you get a ramification of secrecy, or a ramification of the virtual, i.e. that there is a perception that the child sees, that's sort of level one if you like. Then you get that she is seen seeing this, level two, that he sees that she sees this and she sees that, and that we get an evacuation of content and, if you like, the proliferation of secrecy. So to conclude, I think this gives us a much more positive understanding of what it is to read a literary text or to read a work of art, which is not either how it represents its content, which of course I assume we got rid of that quite some time ago, that language or paintings or anything match the world, nor the idea that the set of relations produces its content. You know, we only think there are women because there are stereotypical images in the media, and we all know genders are fiction or something like that. Not that notion of a social construction, but that what we perceive has a potential to produce relations, of course, and that what literature or art does is give us a sense of the possibility of multiple relations. Doesn't actually exhaust those relations, but gives us a sense that there is an inexhaustibility, or if you like to conclude, but that there is secrecy. Thank you.